Well, welcome to the UpWords Podcast. Today I have J.R. Briggs on to talk about his brand new book, which is excellent, highly recommended from our friend Byron Borger from Hearts and Minds Bookstore, which you heard a few episodes ago on the podcast. But The Art of Asking Better Questions, Pursuing Stronger Relationships, Healthier Leadership, and a Deeper Faith. J.R., welcome to the UpWords Podcast.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm looking forward to this conversation with you.
Well, tell us a little bit about how did the book come about? What inspired you to write The Art of Asking Better Questions? Was there a moment that you realized how transformation through questions can kind of occur in people's lives? Where did this come from?
I have always been fascinated by questions, and I am grateful to have grown up in a home where my parents, especially my dad, modeled questions really well. And he'd throw us in the back seat going to the grocery store or going to the ballpark, and he would just ask questions that were beyond the typical questions. They were meaningful questions. And so to me, that was normal. And I just assumed everybody grew up in a home where your dad asked really thoughtful, incisive, engaging questions. Until later, people said, wait, your dad does that? My dad's never asked me any questions. I thought, that's interesting. And so it was modeled really well. And I began to watch my dad even interact with other people and the conversations he would have at church or in the neighborhood or at a ball game, just by being thoughtful in asking questions and being curious. And to me, I took note of that. And I thought, wow, those conversations are fun. As I got older, I realized that the people who were the most interesting, who I actually wanted to be like, I wanted to be around them, I wanted to learn from them, I realized they all had one trait. They all were great, curious question askers, and other people felt valued by their questions when they were in their presence. I also looked at people, I said, I don't know if I really want to spend a lot of time with those people. I realized they didn't ask questions. And so I began to realize that the dimensions of your life expand or shrink depending upon the questions you ask. And so putting all these things together, I thought, questions are so valuable. And for the last decade or so, I've been doing a deep dive into it. And I had a chance to do my dissertation on it of equipping leaders to ask better questions. And so from that, I thought, man, maybe I can steward this passion to be able to help other people, not just with giving them questions, teaching them how to ask better questions. And so that's a bit of the origin story, but I also hope that passion continues to grow over time. So maybe not one moment, but several of these flashpoints converging together.
Yeah. You talk in the book and share a bunch of stories about how questions have opened some doors for you. I'm wondering if you could share maybe one or two stories about where and how asking great questions kind of opens some doors to maybe some experiences that you might want to not have already had. Wondering what maybe a couple of those stories would be and what were the questions that were asked.
Yeah, I could share from my own life, but I want to share a story that I included in there about a jazz musician named Daryl Davis. And I love this story so much. I love telling this story, but Daryl has a really unique hobby where he collects KKK hoods. And you think, well, that's unique. What makes it even more interesting is that Daryl's African American. And people say, how in the world did an African American get to meet with all these Ku Klux Klan leaders from around the country and convince them to give him his robes? And it's a fascinating story. And he uses questions in a disarming and invitational way. And there's one question that is most disarming. And he asks these when he befriends these KKK leaders. And he says, how can you hate me if you know nothing about me? And it totally disarms these individuals. And they say, I don't know. Many of them admit they'd never met an African American before. And so what I find so fascinating are all the pictures he has of his arms around these KKK, former KKK leaders, that they leave the KKK and give their robes to him. And Daryl's dream one day is to open up a museum of just all these KKK robes. He's got over 200 and still counting. And so I just love that story because it wasn't a convincing statement. It wasn't something he yelled at them. It all broke open because he simply asked a question. And it just shows me the power of questions in my own life. But I just wanted to highlight Daryl Davis's
Yeah.
question because that sticks with me. And when I'm with people who are very different than me, I remember Daryl Davis. And I remember, the best way forward is probably a question here, not a brilliant statement.
Mhm. What about a story from your own life that has opened a door, given you an experience that you may not have had already?
Yeah. I was with a pastor, and a pastor, and I use this a lot myself when I'm coaching other leaders, is looking at the story of Bartimaeus, and that's that beautiful story of Bartimaeus where Jesus asks a question: "What do you want me to do for you?" Now, I live in the Philadelphia area, so the snark can sometimes sneak out a little bit here. So, you want to say, "Jesus, the guy's blind. I don't know. Take a wild guess what the dude wants." But of course, Jesus knew. But Jesus asked this because he needed Bartimaeus to know what Bartimaeus wanted. And that question, what do you want me to do for you, when I am feeling stuck in my prayer life, when I am feeling flat, when I am feeling spiritually dry? I love pulling that out and saying, okay, imagine Jesus speaking to me. JR, what do you want me to do for you? I
Mm.
think sometimes as Christians, we get a little squeamish because we think about name it and claim it prosperity gospel, and God's not a genie in a bottle that you rub and what 3 wishes do you want? But we have to remember he is our loving father who loves to hear what's on the heart of his kids, and we're his kids. And he says, you do not have because you do not ask. You do not
Mhm.
ask a question. And so because of that, that has become a very important question for me, is imagining Jesus say, what do you want me to do for you? And that has often unhinged in a good way, unlocked, I should say, where I feel stuck, then I'm able to then connect with God again, of just saying, God, this is on my heart. I'm not demanding it. I
Mhm.
just want you to know. And I know you know already what I want, but I just need to name what I want, what I'm longing for in this season. And so that continues to be a marking question in my journey with Jesus.
A section in the book around what do questions do, and I thought it was really interesting. I think you have a lot of 8 to 10, maybe different things in that
Mhm.
section that the questions kind of do or open doors or form us in some way. Um, I wondered if you want to highlight a couple, and I'm wondering our audience is, typically evangelical Christian, not always,
Mhm.
that are a
Mhm.
part of this podcast. But are there any specific things that Christians should be thinking about
Mm.
from what you offer there?
Yes. Asking great questions, it just has the power and the potential to improve the quality of every single area of our lives: relationships, career, faith, finances, future. Um, and so it can have a significant impact then on myself, my family, my neighborhood, my church, my school, my university, my workplace, online. In fact, I go so far as to say I can't think of a single area where improving the quality of the questions you and I ask will not improve the quality of our lives and the lives of those around us. Because I think few things can bring about change more effectively than the right question asked to the right person at the right time for the right reason. So my brain thinks in metaphors. And so there may be a few metaphors. What does a good question do? It's kind of like keys on a key ring, just unlocking a door that has been locked in the past,
Mm.
or like windows by which we see out into the world, but also mirrors by which we see ourselves. They could be like an archaeologist tool, almost like a trowel or a spade, that there's stuff hidden underground if we'll just dig a little bit, or screwdrivers that kind of pop the lid on a stuck paint can. So there's a lot of things they can do. As far as for Christians, first of all, it can become an amazing tool of how we connect with God.
Mm.
Um, the beautiful thing is, here's God who knows everything, and yet he still chooses to ask questions. Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, was 40 times more like 40 times more likely to ask questions than he was to give answers. And if anybody had the right to not ask any questions and only give answers, it was Jesus. And yet he asked over 300 questions. So I think there's a lot to learn in terms of following who Jesus is. If we want to take following Jesus seriously, It's great we study his miracles and his parables and his teachings. Those are great. But let's not forget, we can learn from his questions as well. But I think if we can think of questions, and I'm not talking questioning as in like doubting our faith, but
Uh-huh.
of asking questions, because questions are about connection. Sometimes it's information, but it's about connection. So how do we connect? How do we love God and love others? Questions are a huge part of that.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of a single close and healthy relationship I have with someone else where there hasn't been significant, thoughtful, important questions asked in our relationship that help to bring us closer. So this can help with evangelism. This can help with discipleship. This can help with how we deepen our prayer lives. When we look at the Psalms, it's filled with questions, tons of questions in the Psalms, including the Psalms of Lament, which are rated R prayers. And a lot of them are rated R questions prayed by a man that God says was a man after his own heart. And so there is permission from the God of the universe to ask questions. And I think sometimes our faith and formation is not stunted by asking questions. I think our faith and formation sometimes is stunted because we don't ask enough of them.
Mm. What about so we were talking about asking a lot of questions externally, right? Into the communities that we're a part of or whatever.
Mhm.
I'm wondering about the questions that we ask ourselves.
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of fear and trepidation around that. I mean, I have that around
Mhm.
sort of just asking some of the questions of ourselves that no one else is asking us, but we know that we should be asking ourselves those questions. How do
Mhm.
you think about kind of the fear dynamic there?
Mhm.
What do we need to do to get over that, to ask really good questions of ourselves?
Yep. Yep. And so asking questions of God, ourselves, and others, I think that's almost like three legs of a stool. Like there's
Mm,
implications. The better I ask questions of God, I think the better I'm able to reflect on myself. Better questions I ask of myself will be a reflection on the questions I ask others, and conversely on that as well. So I think I believe it's impossible to cultivate godly wisdom if we aren't asking ourselves significant questions.
mm,
In fact, worldview is often questions like, is there a God? If so, can he be trusted? What is the good life? What does it mean after I die? I mean, all the major world religions are based on these questions. So everyone's worldview is based on these questions that we ask of ourselves. But on a micro level, I think that we're asking questions so quickly and so often, it's second nature for us. We just need to identify and become aware of those questions. I think that's when we ask better questions and more quality questions, that's when our wisdom grows. Things like, is this a good decision? Will I regret this in 10 minutes, in 10 months, in 10 years? Um, is this full of goodness, truth, and beauty? Does this reflect the fruit of the Spirit? I mean, these are all things that voice in our head we're actually thinking through. Um, or what's the invitation from Jesus in the midst of this situation, good or bad? I think the questions we ask ourselves, especially in hardship, suffering, and failure, will reveal a lot about where we are in our journey with Jesus, our own maturity, our identity. So when people say, yeah, it feels a little meta, it can feel a little meta. I'm asking
yeah.
questions about my questions. And we don't want to drive ourselves crazy or we don't want to be emotionally drained or mentally drained by it. But if I always encourage people, if you can identify and just become aware of the questions you're asking yourself, including the ones you ask most frequently.
Mm,
David Allen said, pay attention to what you're paying attention to.
mhm,
And I think if you can say, man, a lot of my questions are driven by fear. Ooh, what is it that Jesus may want to invite me into when it comes to that? Or a lot of my questions are about vanity or arrogance or self centeredness. Ooh, how would Jesus want to speak into that? Or so I think just being aware, and you can even have close friends around you say, would you just do a questions audit with me? What are you noticing
mm,
that's coming out of my mouth externally? And then I want to kind of backtrack a little bit and say, I wonder what questions I was asking inside before they popped outside of my mouth.
yeah.
So being aware of the questions becomes a huge way that we grow in our wisdom.
Mhm. So you talk, which I love this statement, but you talk about the quality of our life is determined by the quality of the questions that we ask. Um, Unpack what's a good question, what's a bad question? Like how do you frame you know those two different things?
Yeah. I think a bad question is often asked with a bad motive.
Mm,
What's wrong with you? What's your
mhm,
problem? And I think counselors' couches are filled with people who had someone ask a very hurtful question years, sometimes decades earlier, that's stuck in their identity, and it's been hard to get out. So sometimes with a bad motive, sometimes they're unclear. A bad question is sometimes very lazy, vanilla, or unthoughtful.
mhm,
But a good question are the opposite of those. It can be asked with a good motive. It makes me think. I think I mean, all good questions are an invitation to think deeper. In fact, let me word it differently. What if questions are nothing more than an invitation to think deeper?
mhm,
Right?
mhm,
My guess is, Daniel, you just thought a little bit deeper when I asked that question, right? So
mhm,
it's an invitation for creativity, information, new ideas, new possibilities, new connection. When those are happening, those are really good questions. Now, some people say that's the difference between a bad question and a good question. What's the difference between a good question and a great question? And I
mm,
think a great question unlocks new possibilities that wouldn't have been possible with answers. Great questions are also ones that may not be able to be answered easily. Like, I may need 3 weeks or 3 years or 3 decades to unpack that question.
mm.
And so, great questions stick with us, and they form us and shape us and challenge us and mess with us and encourage us. And so it's fun to think through some of those characteristics between a bad, a good, and a great question.
Mm. Are all of our questions seeking an answer? I'm wondering if the form of the questions or the purpose of the question sometimes in community isn't always to seek an answer, more to press into something in our community or an individual that they actually can take when take back and think about those things to
Mhm.
come back with more reformed identity or thought process. Are all of our questions seeking an answer?
Not all of them. In fact, there are 27 different types of questions someone can ask.
Hmm.
And by the way, like a rhetorical question isn't seeking an answer, it's looking to make emphasis, right? Um, but there are other times I can ask a question without any words. Now, it's a little bit
Mhm.
hard for those that might be listening, but you can give a facial expression or you know, what are you talking about? But you don't even have to use words to kind of say, what are you talking about? Um,
Yeah.
so Heather Holleman, who teaches at Penn State, and she wrote a book called The Six Conversations. It's a great book. And in talking with her, she said to me, questions answer two things. They're either for information or connection. And connection could be relationships, or it could be connections to creativity or new ideas or new possibilities. And so if I ask someone, hey, what time is the ball game tonight? 7:30. That's information. But connection could be, you seem really down right now. What's going on? And would you be willing to share with me how you're feeling? That's an invitation for connection. I may not, quote unquote, learn something new about my friend, but I can be there to connect and build trust with that friend, or maybe
Mhm.
both. But I
Mm,
like that idea that Heather Holleman
mhm.
says it's information or connection or
Mm.
both.
Yeah. So in the book, you talk about four levels of questions, um, and you talk about kind of their different purposes. Maybe take us through that framework. I thought that was a really helpful kind of
Mhm.
exercise. If you'd be willing to kind of take us through those four different levels of questions.
Sure. In fact, I'll clarify just a little bit. There are 4 levels of good questions. I think there are 5 levels of questions. I'll call level 0 bad questions. We could
Okay.
call those basement questions, right? Those that are just destructive, hurtful, shameful. But as far as good questions go, level 1 would be what I call questions for information. These are just simple facts, transactional, straightforward, like what time is the ball game tonight, right? They're low risk. They don't require any vulnerability whatsoever. I could ask a stranger and it would not be awkward, right?
Mm,
What's your name? Again, what time does the game begin? But level 2 questions are where we go a little bit deeper, and those are questions for interaction. So it requires some level of trust to engage with someone. So it could be about thoughts and emotions. So engaging that to build further connection. So it could be questions like, how are you feeling about today's meeting with the boss? It requires a little bit more of context. I wouldn't ask a stranger that. Or, oh, when did you become interested in kayaking? I've got to know some context. They like kayaking. And so often it's in the realm of small talk, but it serves an important function of connection there. But I'd have to start with a level 1 before I get to a level 2.
Mhm.
If there's trust there, then I would go to level 3. And level 3 are what I call questions for understanding. And these are feelings and desires. So this requires a deeper level of trust and vulnerability or connection. And so that explores our hopes and our dreams and our disappointments that we may have. So you may ask, what do you really want in life? Or what are some of your fears going into this fall? Um, so the heart of meaningful relationships often occurs in this emotional connection level 3.
Mm.
However, when there's real trust and vulnerability there, what I would call capital V vulnerability, capital I intimacy, those are level 4, and that's questions for transformation. And this plumbs the depths of human experience. So you would only have a few people in this inner circle where level 4 questions would be appropriate: a counselor, a spouse, a best friend, a pastor, an accountability group, whatever it might be, where you're asking questions like, what are you afraid to tell me right now? Or when do you feel most fully seen and alive? And so if you think about it almost, Daniel, like a archery target, the outer ring would be level 1. You could ask just about anybody, but you move in level 2, level 3, and level 4 is the bullseye. Smaller, really important, but reserved when there's utmost trust with someone.
Mm.
And what's helpful is to just think through, oh, what question am I about to ask? In what level?
Mm.
And do I have enough trust to move to the next level? Guys, I think we've all been asked a question and we thought, ooh, that's creepy. That's awkward. Who are you? What's your name again? It's
That's right.
because somebody tried to enter into a level where we didn't have trust developed in the level before we went
Mm.
to that new level. So I found that framework to be incredibly helpful for me and a fun exercise to do when I explain this and I'm in a seminar or a training group is to say, okay, now I want you to turn to a partner for 5 or 10 minutes. And I want to see if you can develop a list of 2 or 3 questions in each category of Jesus's questions, because Jesus
Mm.
asks questions in all 4 levels. And it becomes another way to dig in and learn from Jesus of levels 1, 2, 3, and 4, because he asks them in the Gospels and has various levels of interaction and transformation with people.
Yeah. You do a lot of work with leaders in your work in your ministry. What are some questions that leaders should be asking that they're
Mm,
not currently asking in
mm,
organizational, institutional life?
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, One of the most important questions that I think leaders need to ask is what and who gives me the right to lead? In other
Mm.
words, why should someone follow me? I think we need to wrestle with that. Not like, well, because people are here. No, what gives me the right to lead other people? I think every leader needs to understand what is leadership and come up with their own definition. What does it mean to be a leader? Another one that I've found to be really helpful is we've all heard the phrase servant leadership, but a mentor challenged me years ago to say, is it better to be a servant who leads or a leader who serves? And really pressing into that. And he helped me wrestle with that's not just nuance. If I'm a leader who serves, but I'm taken out of a leadership role, that messes with my identity. But if I'm a servant who leads, who's then taken out of a leadership role and is asked to be a janitor at a local high school, I can be a servant who cleans. And it
Mm.
doesn't mess with my identity. It messes with how I live out my identity, a different expression of it. So I think that's another important one. Am I a servant who leads or am I a leader who serves? And one of my favorite ones as well, Daniel, is um, because I'm leading, who in turn is flourishing? And to sit with that one it takes some time, but if Christian leadership is about the flourishing of humanity for the sake of God's glory, so who is it? It could be raising 2 little kids at home. Great. It could be an entire college generation. It could be my team at work, my neighborhood. But because I'm in leadership, who in turn is flourishing? That's a challenging and encouraging one that keeps me pointed. It keeps me pointed toward my North Star in how I lead, and I think others have as well.
Mm. Yeah, I often think about, I know in the book you're talking about a lot about leadership pieces. I think about, a lot of us are in kind of mid-range leadership roles, right? So we're leading laterally with colleagues, we're leading up with somebody that's supervising us, or a senior leader in an organization, and we're leading often down to others. Are there any specific questions or types of questions people in that range should be asking in those different leadership areas?
Hmm. You certainly can be asking up, so if I'm reporting to someone, to just say, I'm a big feedback fan. I'm a feedback junkie. Feedback is the breakfast of champions. And so it's one of the best ways we grow. And so one of the ways to do that is just to ask for feedback, specific feedback. You don't want to say, so how am I doing? You ask a generic question, you're going to get a generic answer. But if you ask a thoughtful, engaging, specific question, you often get a thoughtful, engaging, specific answer. So to say, over the last 6 months, I've tried really hard to work on my communication, both written and verbal. Do you see me growing in those areas? And if so, where? And if not, what are some ways I can grow? Or, whatever it might be. But the more specific you can be of seeking feedback, the better. And it could be, what book do you think I should read? Is there a podcast or two you think I can grow and learn from? But can you give me feedback, and maybe even better, feed forward? If I were, the next 6 months, if I were to grow in my communication from your seat as my supervisor, how do you think I should grow? And what are some ways I could go about doing that? As far as leading other people, when I've had people report to me, I always end a meeting by asking the same 2 questions, and they know it. And the same 2 questions are, number 1, for you to flourish this week, where do you need me to be more involved? And number 2, for you to flourish this week, where do you need me to get out of your way? And as long as they're honest with me about those 2 answers, it's amazing what happens. And they'll say, I'm having to interview this person. Would you sit in on those interviews? Sure, no problem. And sometimes they need to be honest with me because I've got some blind spots of where I'm in the way. My intentions might be good, but they might say, I think I've got this project. You keep asking about it, but I really have it. If I have questions, I'll come to you and say, you're right. I don't want to hover. I'm excited about it, but I can see how that's applying pressure. No problem. Thank you for your honesty. And so to me, the types of, so much of it is context, Daniel, right? I mean, are we leading up? Are we leading down? Are we with colleagues and peers? But if we can be thinking through what kind of question and what is my motive in wanting to ask it, that can help us develop good, thoughtful, and wise questions.
Yeah. Well, JR, I'm wondering if you are okay if we flip the script here a little bit. And I'm wondering if you are okay kind of modeling a little bit of what we've been discussing and asking me questions. I'd be curious I think you have a lot of wisdom around this, and would love to just see kind of maybe how this is modeled in kind of real practical experiences.
Daniel, I'd love the opportunity to do that. I have no script in front of me, but I do love to ask questions. And so I certainly would love to be able to do that. And maybe your listeners, as I'm doing that, can think through, is that a level 1, a level 2, a level 3 question? Because that may help as well. But I promise you, Daniel, there will be no curveballs or gotcha questions here. But I'm curious, Daniel, tell me, what is the dream of this podcast? What do you hope 6 months, 12 months, 5 years from now? What would just make you well up with tears in your eyes out of gratitude and joy?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really look at media as an opportunity for formation. I think this is a model of media that, lots of people are engaging with in our world. And I think really God can speak through and the gospel can be really present in all forms. And so I would love for people to have listened to a podcast and come to faith. I would love
Mm,
for somebody to be ultimately transformed um, in making better decisions about their faith, their family, their career, based upon what they're hearing
mm,
from this. And so, I really look at it as a vessel that God is using to form and transform people's lives.
mm. So, what do you know now, Daniel, that you wish you knew when you started the podcast?
Yeah. Probably the amount of work that it actually takes. It's not just, flipping on cameras and microphones and walking away. There's a lot of prep before and afterwards.
Right.
And I think actually those details actually make or break the podcast or a
Mm,
podcast or media in any form.
mm,
I think those are really important for how what's being produced ultimately to audiences. And so, there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of behind the scenes work that's done that's never really seen, but hopefully comes across within the
mm.
conversations that we have.
Absolutely. And by the way, I just want to say this too, Daniel. You have asked me great questions. That doesn't always happen on podcast interviews. And so, thanks. You've given me a gift. You've shown hospitality to
Mm,
me by
mm,
reading the book and being really thoughtful on the questions. And so, you've honored me, which again reinforces the whole point and the purpose of asking good questions. So,
yeah.
I see some gifts and some passion and some skill for you in asking questions. So, I'm curious,
Mm,
how did you grow to become a good question asker?
uh, it's a good question. I I think I've always had, a question. Questions has always kind of been a form of communication for me. I love to listen probably more than to talk.
Mm,
And so that's just been kind of, I would say, a natural tendency of my own growing up years and formative years, and even, with colleagues, people that I work with around here. I would rather hear about them than maybe talk about myself. And so
mm,
I think that probably helps a little bit in the
mhm,
framework of things. Um, and I think I've just seen it model really well.
mm,
I think just listening to podcast, I was listening to a lot of podcasts, other forms of media, personal connections with other people. And so I've seen it modeled, I think, which helps out a lot. And
mm,
as you were talking about earlier, your dad growing up, that was
mm,
just modeled. And I think that's a really interesting framework that we can all push into our family. We just got table cards for dinner time,
mhm.
and they have questions on them, and we use those around the dinner table,
Love
um,
it.
and we we have a much better conversation around the dinner
Mhm,
table when those are present than when they're not. And so, busy family and trying to kind of, get everyone to the actual physical table sometimes is a chore. But the reward I think has been great when we've been able to have those really good questions around the table for all of us.
yeah, that's fantastic. You're so intentional about that, Daniel. I'm curious if you were to grow in your question asking ability and passion by like 10% in the next year,
Hmm. Yeah.
how might you go about doing that?
Yeah. Um, I think listening a little bit better.
Mm,
I think that there's um that I also think about leading questions, are the questions that I'm asking, are they leading in the specific direction that I want a specific outcome for? So I would say that that's probably another area.
mhm. What are some of the best or most important questions you've been asked in your lifetime?
Mm. I think just I wouldn't maybe like name specifics, but I would think about different types of people that I've been around. So
Mhm,
when it's been in like an intentional mentor relationship, there's been like really like in college, high school and college, and just, right out of college. I was really intentional about having mentors around me, and those mentors asked really good questions. Um, that I think, and a wide variety of different things around faith and family and, being young, married. um, in those specific areas. But I think that was really helpful
Hmm.
uh, to see it modeled out of kind of the wisdom that people bring into those relationships.
Yeah, great. Now, media obviously can span whatever age range and demographic, but
Hmm. Yeah.
you and I talked, and I don't know, probably in the college, young adult, 20 something, 30 something, is probably the target audience on that. When it comes to thinking about 20 somethings and 30 somethings and the next generation, what gives you immense hope, and also what concerns you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll say the hope one first. I I love the next generation. I think that there's so much potential there. With it, I love seeing this resurgence. I think Gen Z coming forward, really owning their faith. They're the largest group now within the church. Barna just reported on that. Doesn't surprise me at all to see just floods of Gen Z within the church. So, and I think the intentionality that they're coming in with their faith, um, is really, really exciting.
Mm,
It's genuine, authentic. Those are very keywords or buzzwords around, but I think it's really important. And they can smell inauthenticity very quickly. Like they know exactly when people are not being authentic, when they're not being, real with folks. They know that really well. I think the thing that worries me is just loneliness of probably the next generation. And I think of college kids who go to class, come home, and spend 6 to 8 hours playing video games, online with others every night, after going to class. Or the isolation of just family members being in a house together, but knows that no one's ever actually communicating and talking together. There's always on a device and doing things. And so I think the isolation piece is really troublesome.
mm,
And I don't have a good fix. I mean, I'm
mm,
not an expert in this area, and I don't have a good fix for it, but I do think it's something that we all need to be aware of
mm,
in this next generation.
mm. Can I ask you one more that's a little bit
Yeah,
more on the vulnerability side? This maybe is a
yeah,
level
yeah,
3 or 3 plus
yeah.
on this. But I talked about the Bartimaeus question earlier, where
Mm,
Jesus asked, "What do you want me to do for you?" I'm curious, how might you answer that if Jesus asked you that question?
mm, mm. I think the thing would be, what doors are you going to open? I
Mm,
think that would be the question that I'd be looking for. I think you know there's so many opportunities. JR, you've been so gracious with your time today in this, and I've
mm,
learned so much from you. um, and just connection and points with other people.
mm,
Um, I think that's so important in our formation, and
mm,
especially in our faith formation, of who God's calling us to be and how He's calling us to live out that in the world.
mm, That's great. Well, thanks for letting me turn the tables on you here. You did pretty well there, Daniel. But
That's
yeah, and
great. Good.
hopefully this allowed listeners to see this in real time of what this can look like. And Daniel, I learned a lot from you, so thanks for your vulnerability
Mm,
and
mm.
playing a little conversational pickleball with me, hitting the ball back
Yeah.
over the net here a few different times. So
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, hey, JR, I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast. The book
uh,
is The Art of Asking Better Questions, Pursuing Stronger Relationships, Healthier Leadership, and a Deeper Faith. It's so good.
mm,
Highly recommended, not only from me, but I know from a bunch of others. And congratulations on the book. And we're so
thank you.
excited that to have this out in the world, and so others can be formed by it.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate you having me on. And this is a passion project of mine. And so any opportunity to be able to talk about it is a great joy. So thank you for the invitation.
Great. Well, thank you, audience, and go in peace.